We're going to start, I'm very pleased to say, with Imre Bangha, who studied Indology in Budapest and holds a doctorate in Hindi from Visva-Bharati.
Visva-Bharati.
Thank you. In 1998, so a long time ago, he inaugurated the teaching of Hindi and Urdu in Oxford, for some years holding at the same time appointments in De Montfort and in Romania, inaugurating that teaching after it had fallen into desuetude since the 19th century teaching of Hindustani. And since 2009, he's been Associate Professor of Hindi and a Fellow of Wolseley. And he's going to talk about his research with Jay Lewis. And Jay, you're in charge.
I see. Well, please, I'll turn this over to Imre.
Yes. Well, thank you. I'm going to talk about one of the most exciting bits of my research, which started with the discovery of, not the discovery, but rather the identification of a text, which I found to be the oldest dated text of Hindi. It seems to be quite spectacular. It has always been there, just like Mount Everest, but someone had to point at it that this is the oldest. This was a little bit of a kind of philological research, and I will talk a little bit about that. But the interesting questions arose after doing the philological groundwork. What is Hindi? How can we define what is the earliest? So, the literary piece is dated 23 August 1354, and we even know about the constellation when it was finished. So it's quite a firmly dated literary piece. It's a kind of medieval Harry Potter about the story of Pradyumna, who was a great wizard, and most of the story is concerned with his youth, how he learns wizardry. Now, I talk about Hindi, and this is what I prefer to call Old Hindi. It's a different dialect than modern standard Hindi, and also there is a chronological distance. Now, I should make a point that many modern liberal as well as anti-Hindi thinkers do not consider Old Hindi Hindi. I have talked to Asla briefly earlier that sometimes there is a similar distancing between modern Turkish and Ottoman Turkish. So this Old Hindi literature is incomprehensible. For many people it is irrelevant, for many others it's feudalist, so it's distanced and less taught in Indian universities. Modern Hindi started in the 19th century, according to most historiography. I'm reconsidering that, but I'm not going to talk about that now. The traditional linear view of linguistic development in India is presented in the handout here, that we have Old Indo-Aryan, and the literary version of Old Indo-Aryan is Sanskrit. Middle Indo-Aryan had various literary versions. The antecedent of Hindi is perceived to be Shauraseni Prakrit and Shauraseni Apabhransha. And then we come to the new Indo-Aryan languages in the second millennium of our era, and I'm going to talk about Hindi, including also its literary idioms, Brajbhasha and Avadhi. The traditional view of Hindi literature was defined by colonial and later nationalist historiography. Nationalist means the time of independence struggle, and a nation needed a language. Now in India, it's difficult to count how many languages there are. Estimates vary between 400 and 1,600. So what should be the national language? Hindi has been identified by many as it is the most widely spoken language, and it was also used as lingua franca. It had its own struggles, and it is more and more documented in modern scholarship how modern Hindi came to dominate the linguistic scene in India. One important thing for modern Hindi was the production of literary history, and the literary history of Ramchand Shukla, whose name is down here in the handout, is the standard literary history. It was first published in 1928-29, and since then it has been more than a school book. Even today, people refer to Ramchand Shukla's literary history if they want to say something about Hindi. So it's a terribly influential literary history. It was defined by its time of the Indian independence struggle, and it wanted to show the greatness of Hindi. And part of the greatness is showing old literature. And what Ramchand Shukla has put in his chapter about the Hindi Adikal, the initial period, has been discredited since, either because these works are not Hindi but Apabhransha, so the earlier linguistic phase, just like the Jain and the Buddhist poems, or sometimes Shukla attributed to early authors later works, and sometimes he just saw later works and attributed an early date for them. So he produced a literary history of 1,000 years, and his estimate is quite moderate because there were other literary historians who proposed 1,500 years of literary history. Now, Shukla's early period has been discredited by subsequent philological research, but then what remains? There has been a race for the earliest works at the other place in Cambridge. So John Smith, a Sanskritist, produced a Hindi literary text which he estimated to date from the mid-15th century quite firmly. And then his colleague R.S. McGregor produced, started to work on two literary texts which are even more firmly dated to 1435 and 1444. This was a race, probably a kind of jocular competition between two colleagues, but McGregor's works on the Vishnudas's epic adaptations have been taken up by Sheldon Pollock. Sheldon Pollock is one of the dominant names of Sanskrit literary histories, and his book, The Language of Gods in the World of Men, is a survey of Sanskrit literature, and especially the ends of Sanskrit literature when vernacularization comes in, and how the cosmopolitan Sanskrit ends its dominance in India and gives place to vernacular languages. So Pollock talks about the Sanskrit cosmopolis, which breaks down in the second millennium of our era, the vernacular millennium. Now, what he says about Hindi literarization, so how Hindi becomes a literary language and starts to dislodge Sanskrit, is that the earliest work comes from the Hindu kingdom of Gwalior, which is a small kingdom, and these are Vishnudas's epic adaptations, which I mentioned, Pandav Charit, which is Mahabharata, and Ramayana, which is just the Ramayana epic. Manuscripts are from the 18th century, which refers to the fluidity of vernacular transmission, since manuscript kept updating the language and also the text with the new concepts and new linguistic features. So what the manuscripts of these works that we have do not fully reflect the linguistic situation of Vishnudas's times. However, the dates are embedded into the poem, so there is no real reason to question them. Our methodology is to look for dated works because undated works have changed over the times, and we don't know what date to assign to them. Now comes my research into this context, that I have argued that the language of the Pandav Charit and of the Ramayana is modernized into later, more or less 17th, 18th century Braj Bhasha. And there are several archaisms, and these archaisms kind of opened up a new window. because I found that these archaisms are shared with the work that I have found, the Hindi Harry Potter, which is the Pradyumna Charit from 1354, and it's a mythological epic. The only shortcoming of it is that it is not Hindu. It is Jain, so it doesn't really fit into an Indian nationalism which had a discourse of a dominant Hindu culture. And I've managed to find another work from 1366, and this is really my finding. It hasn't been treated in any Hindi literary history. It is in manuscript, never published, and I'm trying to come up with a publication of that, which was published in Bihar, which was written in Bihar, but now the manuscript is in Gujarat, so quite far away. What we know, there is a deep connection between Vishnu Das's epics and these earlier Jain works. They are of the same narrative genre and use normally the same poetic meter. The Jain works have a prominent role of the mother as of the mother of the hero, and it's an aside that probably the works were read out for an audience of females who were illiterate but definitely enjoyed listening to these works. Also, the Pradyumna Charit manuscript circulated in East Rajasthan and in the classical Hindi belt. So again, we can argue that this is, we are very close to Old Hindi. They are produced in the language of Vishnu Das's archaisms, and that was really fascinating to find. We didn't know what to do with Vishnu Das's archaisms, and suddenly I was able to encode them in 100 years earlier texts. Also, later manuscripts partially updated the language into Braj Bhasha, just like in the case of Vishnu Das, but fortunately we have got earlier manuscripts from the mid-16th century without the linguistic updates, or probably moderate. Also, another step further was that these works were produced in the Hindi belt, but their language is the same as the language of other Jain works, which was produced in Gujarat and Rajasthan, so west of the Hindi belt. And looking up Gujarati books, I found that this language is called Old Gujarati. In other works, this language was called Old Western Rajasthani, and in yet other works call this language Maru Gurjar, Maru referring to the desert lands of Rajasthan and Gurjar to Gujarat. And this literary idiom has been used from the late 12th century onwards, primarily by Jains. Jains are a very old religion, as old as Buddhism, still holding ground in India, but their followers number just a couple of millions. So not hundreds of millions like Hindus or Buddhists. Now, what are the conclusions? One thing that Sheldon Pollock argued was that vernacularization, so committing vernaculars to the written language, start in royal courts and then emanates all around a territory as the royal developments are emulated. So it's a social-political act when a ruler or a ruling elite decides to move on to a new literary idiom. Here I find Jains. Jains were primarily merchants. They are extreme non-violent religion. They cannot kill any insect even, or they don't want to kill even vegetables, so they would prefer fruits, by eating which you don't kill the tree. These Jains were merchants, and they had a huge network all over North India. And they needed a literary idiom that if someone composes something in Gujarat, another Jain in Bihar, 2,000 kilometers to the east, would understand it. So it is rather the network that created the need for communicating with people. What I have seen is that this early cosmopolitan vernacular, just using Sheldon Pollock's framework, is first inflected with local features. So that's what probably Vishnu Das did. composing in this idiom but using local Braj Bhasha features. Some others would use this idiom using local Awadhi features. And later it would break down into various literary idioms. One of them is Gujarati, another one Rajasthani, another one Braj Bhasha, another one Awadhi. Rajasthani, Braj Bhasha and Awadhi came under the umbrella of Hindi, while Gujarati had its own independent life. Now, just questions to finish. To what extent is Maru Gurjar, this language of the earliest works, is vernacular and not Apabhransha? This is something that is very difficult to answer, so not belonging to an earlier linguistic layer which is not called vernacular. And what is exactly the meaning of vernacular in this context? And also, spatially, to what extent is Maru Gurjar Hindi? It was primarily cultivated in Gujarat and is the old form of Gujarati. Gujaratis call it Old Gujarati, or some Rajasthanis would call it Old Western Rajasthani. And now, shall the entire Old Gujarati corpus be considered to be Hindi, as there is a continuity between Old Gujarati used in the Hindi heartland, and then later Braj Bhasha, which is clearly Hindi. So these are just a few questions about how to define a literary tradition, and where can we arrive with a single philological discovery, ending up with bigger questions. And I have talked to various colleagues within the faculty about many of the questions that I am investigating. And it seems that there are no clear-cut definitions on what to consider a different language when we see diachronic developments. For example, Bjarke says that the Old Japanese is considered to be the part of the Japanese literary canon, although no one really understands it. The same is true about Anglo-Saxon and English, that linguists would call it two different languages, but still part of the same literary canon. So it will come to modern literary canon formations, but still I would like to keep my discovery and make it public that this is the first work of Hindi. I don't know how to do it, and now the I have ideas, but probably a discussion with faculty members can just help me with this.
Well, thank you very much. Gosh, I, of course, am so ignorant of this topic, so I can only point to a couple of things, and then if someone actually has a question, please do ask that. I find it intriguing that I deal with East Asia, and so it's intriguing that Imre is playing with this introduction of vernacularization, which is, for better or worse, Sheldon Pollock has given us a framework in which we can at least argue about it. And the languages of East Asia, then, when did they become vernacular? And was there always a vernacularization? And so literary hegemony, all of these questions are at play, and I'm really happy that he's touching upon that, because that allows us to generalize, and I can almost glimpse the significance of what he's doing. The final question, can we have a single philological discovery, an origin point, is really a nationalist pursuit, I think, and probably you can spend the rest of your life in some silly illusion trying to find that. But it's extremely useful to pick up text that you have and say, okay, from this point we can begin to, you can put down markers along the road even if there is no origin point per se, but you can identify markers, and then that allows you some kind of, I guess, philological, even in a moment, literary, historical progress in research. And so all of this is really fascinating. The question, though, that you didn't touch upon is what constitutes literature? And I know that that's probably a pointless question to ask. You're focusing on what constitutes Hindi, and I'm also interested in actually the content, if there's a thematic content to it that marks it out, if there's not, whether that's of any importance at all.
Yeah, well, again, Sheldon Pollock comes up with the idea that what constitutes literature has been defined in Sanskrit as Sanskrit kavya. I would call it rather high literature, and he excludes anything that is not written from the concept of literature. And kavya has various characteristics that have been discussed by Sanskrit aesthetes, and he looks for works that emulate the kavya style in the vernaculars. Now, all these works that I have been talking about emulate to some extent the kavya style in the vernaculars, so would fall into that category. But and at the same time, Pollock has been criticized precisely for his exclusion of orature, oral literature, from his purview, especially in a culture where orality plays a central role.
Oh.
So these works have been written down. We have them in manuscripts, but probably they were read out to an audience.
Oh, yes. So that complicates it even more. Yes, because of course orality long predates anything that is written down. I'm deadly aware of the time, and I'm also deadly aware of my own ignorance. So if people here have burning questions, please ask.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm very interested to know a bit more about, first of all, the context and the purposes of writing these texts down. If this was a new thing to do, there must have been a reason for doing it. So I don't know, maybe we don't know anything about it, but you suggested these texts were read out, so for what kind of audiences would that have been? And also, do we know anything about the impact that writing these languages for the first time had in maybe standardizing the languages, or, you know?
Well, I think it was the Jain networks. So probably merchants just traveled around North India, and along their together with their merchandise, they also carried a couple of manuscripts, maybe the latest compositions of some authors. The manuscripts of the Pradyumna Charit, Harry Potter, I found scattered in, let us say, in a circle of 500 kilometers within Delhi. So it is very much the Hindi area. Now the only manuscript of the second work, the Jaan Panchami Chaupai, is found now in Patan in Gujarat, but the work was composed 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers to the east in Rajgir in Bihar. So they traveled, and this is very important, that manuscripts travel. They are not like inscriptions, which are meant to be in one place and read in eternity. So if inscriptions are diachronic, then manuscripts would be much more synchronic but spatial. Now, about the audience, we can only guess, and since the increased role of the mother figure, I would expect mothers, elderly ladies in the audience. These mothers are the ones who pull the strings. The sons perform extraordinary deeds. So imagine the mother of Harry Potter kind of manipulating Harry Potter. And this is what is happening there. And it's a polygamic society. So one important thing for the mother is status above all the other co-wives. And it is the son who helps her to achieve a higher status. So I would expect that these texts, amongst the audience, there were the mothers. Probably illiterate, because at that time there wasn't much female literacy, but definitely enjoying that the mothers have, in fact, the best role. And they are not romantic. So the sons get almost arranged marriages, or they get a wife, but they just pass over it.
I think we're up against the time, are we?
I think we probably should, yes.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thanks.